That flagpole, General, is a violation of Section 12, subsection C, paragraph 4 of the Liberty Meadows Covenant, which clearly states that no unapproved permanent structures over 20 feet are permitted. The fine is $500 plus a $50 per day penalty until the structure is removed. Pay it or we'll put a lien on your house. The woman standing on my freshly cut lawn, a hefty figure squeezed into a shockingly pink tracksuit, tapped a manicured nail on the clipboard she held like a holy tablet. Her name was Karen Miller, president of the Homeowners Association, and her voice carried the grating certainty of someone who had never been successfully told no in her life. The word general dripped from her lips, not with respect, but with a cloying, condescending poison, as if my 35 years of service were just some quaint hobby I'd recently given up. She was looking past me at the 25-foot aluminum pole from which the American flag, the very same flag that had flown over my command post in Afghanistan, now snapped smartly in the afternoon breeze. The loss wasn't just the $500, a sum I could easily pay. It was the casual, bureaucratic desecration of something that had cost men under my command everything. Her threat of a lien was a declaration of war, and in that moment, she had no idea of the strategic blunder she had just committed. She had chosen to fight a battle of paperwork and intimidation against a man whose entire career was built on logistics, strategy, and overwhelming force. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board member who thinks they're the dictator of their own little suburban kingdom, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, and in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and share your own HOA nightmare. It's important to know you're not alone in these fights. Now, let me tell you how I handled mine. My war with Karen didn't start with that flagpole. It started the moment my wife, Eleanor, and I signed the closing papers on this house. We'd bought it for the quiet, the view of the mountains, and its proximity to Fort Sheridan, the base I had commanded for the last 5 years of my career. It was supposed to be a peaceful retirement, a place to decompress from a life lived on high alert. We read the HOA covenants, of course. I read them like I would a treaty or a set of operational orders. They were dense, full of legalese about lawn maintenance, approved paint colors, and trash can placement. Nothing seemed overly draconian. Nothing hinted at the petty tyrant who wielded them. The flagpole was the first thing I planned. I'd carried that specific flag with me through 3 tours. It was folded in my duffel when we were taking fire outside of Fallujah, and it flew over my desk during the long nights planning the very operations that kept the soldiers on this neighboring base safe. It wasn't a decoration, it was a memorial. I hired a professional crew, had a proper concrete base poured, and erected the commercial-grade pole precisely according to flag code, with its own dedicated solar-powered light for nighttime illumination. It was a thing of beauty and respect. I hadn't even had the chance to enjoy a full day of it before Karen's shadow fell across my lawn, bringing with it the stink of cheap perfume and absolute authority. Her opening salvo, that clinical recitation of a bylaw, was designed to shock and disarm. But all it did was bring my old training roaring back to the surface. Rule 1 of any engagement, know your enemy. And I was looking right at her. My initial response was not to argue, but to gather intelligence. I gave Karen a calm, measured nod. "I see," I said, my voice betraying none of the cold fury coiling in my gut. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Miss Miller. I'll need a copy of that violation notice and the specific covenant you're citing. I believe there may be a misunderstanding regarding federal law." Her face, already florid, seemed to inflate with indignation. "There's no misunderstanding, General," she sneered again. "The HOA rules are the law in Liberty Meadows. Federal law doesn't dictate the height of your lawn ornaments." She thrust the clipboard at me, a carbon copy of the fine already filled out. It was a practiced, efficient motion. She'd done this 100 times before. As she turned and waddled back to her golf cart, which she drove around the neighborhood like a miniature patrol vehicle, Eleanor came to the door. She'd seen the whole exchange, her arms crossed, her expression a mirror of my own controlled anger. "Lawn ornament?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on the flag. "After everything that flag represents?" I put an arm around her, my eyes following Karen's triumphant departure. "This isn't about the flag, Elle. Not to her," I said, the carbon copy crinkling in my fist. "This is about power. She just picked the wrong hill to die on." The battle lines had been drawn on my own front lawn, and the first phase of my operation was already beginning in my mind: reconnaissance and documentation. I was going to turn my retirement into a command post, and the target was the unchecked tyranny of the Liberty Meadows HOA. The fine was not a debt to be paid. It was the first round fired in a war I had no intention of losing. Karen Miller had just made the gravest mistake of her petty reign. She had mistaken a sleeping lion for a house cat, and I was about to wake up. I spent the rest of that evening not in anger, but in methodical preparation. Anger is a poor strategic partner. It clouds judgment and leads to rash decisions. Instead, I channeled my frustration into process. Eleanor set up a pot of coffee while I cleared the dining room table, turning it into my operational headquarters. I laid out the thick binder of HOA covenants, bylaws, and meeting minutes we'd been given at closing. Alongside it, I placed a fresh legal pad, a set of highlighters, and my laptop. This was familiar territory. It was no different than dissecting an enemy's order of battle or analyzing terrain maps before an operation. The first order of business was the specific violation Karen had cited. Section 12, subsection C, paragraph 4. I found it easily. It was a vaguely worded rule about permanent structures, which included fences, sheds, and gazebos. Flagpoles were not explicitly mentioned. This was the first weakness: ambiguity. An enemy that relies on vague rules is an enemy that can be defeated by specifics. My next step was to cross-reference her claim with federal law. I typed "Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 into my search engine. The text was clear and unequivocal. A homeowners association may not adopt or enforce any policy that would restrict or prevent a member of the association from displaying the flag of the United States on residential property. It allowed for reasonable restrictions on time, place, and manner, but it explicitly prohibited any rule that banned the display altogether. My 25-foot flagpole was a standard residential size, installed professionally and safely. It was a textbook example of what the law was designed to protect. I printed a copy of the act and highlighted the relevant passages. This would be my primary weapon in the initial negotiation phase. I wasn't naive enough to think it would be a silver bullet. Bureaucrats like Karen have a thick armor of willful ignorance, but it was ammunition. The next morning, I drafted a formal letter. I didn't use email. I wanted a paper trail, something that required a signature upon receipt. My letter was polite, professional, and firm. I stated my position clearly, cited the federal law, and attached a printed copy. I respectfully requested that the violation be rescinded and that the HOA acknowledge my right to fly the flag. I concluded by stating that while I hoped for an amicable resolution, I was fully prepared to defend my rights. I made 2 copies, one for my files, one to send. I drove to the post office and sent it via certified mail with a return receipt requested. This was a critical step. It created a legal record of communication. Karen could not later claim she never received it. The cost of certified mail was a small investment in the architecture of my case. For the next 2 days, there was silence. The flag flew, and 2 more violation notices, each for $50, appeared in my mailbox, tucked neatly beside the legitimate mail as if they belonged there. I carefully placed each one into a file folder labeled HOA Correspondence, Unlawful Fines. I did not pay them. Paying them would be an admission of guilt, a concession I was unwilling to make. On the 3rd day, the certified mail receipt returned, bearing Karen's looping, self-important signature. She had received my letter. Her response came that afternoon, not in a formal letter, but in another violation notice. Tucked inside was a handwritten note on garish, floral stationery. Federal law does not apply to private contracts, it read. The Liberty Meadows covenants are a private contract you agreed to. The fines now total $650. Pay up. K. Miller, President. It was the exact argument I had anticipated, a classic, oft-repeated, and completely incorrect interpretation of the law. Her arrogance was breathtaking. She was doubling down on her ignorance, confident that her title and a thick stack of bylaws made her invincible. Eleanor read the note over my shoulder, her jaw tight. She's not going to back down, is she? I shook my head, a grim smile touching my lips. No, she isn't. I looked out the window at the flag, its colors vibrant against the blue sky. And neither are we. Phase 1 is complete. She's rejected a diplomatic solution. Now we move to Phase 2, escalation. The dining room table was no longer just a place for research. It was now the nerve center for a counteroffensive. Karen Miller thought she was enforcing a simple rule. What she didn't understand was that she had just escalated a minor skirmish into a full-blown campaign. And I was now going to bring the full weight of my strategic training to bear upon her little kingdom. Phase 2 began with a shift in focus from direct confrontation to intelligence gathering and environmental shaping. In military terms, I needed to understand the terrain and identify key assets and liabilities within the operational area. In this case, the Liberty Meadows subdivision. My first action was to purchase a small, high-quality digital voice recorder. From that moment forward, any and all interactions with Karen or any other HOA representative would be recorded, and I would make sure to legally inform them of that fact at the start of each conversation. Documentation is the bedrock of any successful campaign against a bureaucracy. My second action was to expand my study of the HOA's governing documents. I didn't just reread the covenants, I dissected them. I cross-referenced bylaws, searched for inconsistencies, and paid special attention to the sections governing HOA meetings, elections, and the process for amending the rules. I discovered that the board, and Karen specifically as president, had a great deal of discretionary power, but they were also bound by strict procedural rules for levying fines, placing liens, and communicating with homeowners. Rules she had already violated by failing to provide a formal hearing process before escalating penalties. I created a spreadsheet, my violation matrix, tracking each fine, the date it was issued, the bylaw cited, and the specific procedural error Karen had made in its issuance. Her sloppy paperwork and arrogant disregard for due process were becoming my most valuable assets. But documents alone wouldn't win this war. I needed human intelligence. I needed to know if my situation was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of behavior. My morning walks, previously a time for quiet reflection, became reconnaissance missions. I started carrying a small notebook. I began with the houses that showed signs of personality, the ones that subtly pushed against the neighborhood's enforced uniformity, a brightly colored welcome mat, a small collection of garden gnomes, a non-standard mailbox. These were the likely dissidents. My first conversation was with a young woman named Sarah Jackson, who lived 3 streets over. I saw her frantically trying to wrangle a bright blue plastic slide back into her garage as Karen's golf cart made a slow pass down the street. I introduced myself, and after a moment of hesitation, she opened up. The Jacksons were a young military family, her husband a major currently deployed from Fort Sheridan. Karen, she told me, had been fining them weekly for lawn clutter, specifically their 4-year-old son's toys. She told me, Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and exhaustion, that this isn't a military barracks and we need to maintain a higher standard. The insult was as deliberate as it was cruel. I listened patiently, took notes, and gave her my phone number. "You're not alone in this," I told her. 2 days later, I spoke with Mr. Gable, a widower in his late 70s who was tending his prize-winning roses. His violation? The decorative stone border around his flower bed was, according to Karen, half an inch too high. He'd received 3 fines and a notice to cure the violation by removing the stones he had laid himself in memory of his late wife. He was heartbroken and intimidated. He was on a fixed income, and the threat of fines was a source of constant anxiety. The story started to form a mosaic of petty tyranny. A family fined because their basketball hoop was left at the curb for 2 hours after their son finished playing. A couple ordered to repaint their front door because the shade of beige they'd used was inconsistent with the approved palette, despite having gotten the paint chip number directly from the HOA's own guidelines. In every case, Karen was the sole enforcer, the judge, jury, and executioner. She seemed to target the vulnerable, the young, the elderly, and especially military families, perhaps seeing their transient nature as a weakness. My file grew thicker. I had dates, names, photographs of the violations, and copies of the fines. I was no longer just fighting for my flagpole. I was now the de facto commander of a small, frightened insurgency. I was building a case not just against a single bad rule, but against a corrupt and abusive system personified by one woman on a golf cart. My next target was the HOA's finances. Public records requests are a powerful tool. I formally requested copies of the last 3 years of the Liberty Meadows HOA budget, expense reports, and all vendor contracts. This was my right as a homeowner. Karen could delay, but she could not legally refuse. I knew with the certainty of a commander who senses a critical flaw in the enemy's defenses that the money trail would lead me directly to the heart of her rotten little empire. The battle had moved from my front lawn to a war of attrition fought with paper, records, and the slow, steady aggregation of truth. The arrival of the HOA financial documents marked a significant escalation in my campaign. Karen had clearly delayed as long as possible, but a second certified letter from me, this time citing the specific state statutes that compelled her to release the records, had forced her hand. She left a thick manila envelope on my doorstep, a passive-aggressive act meant to avoid direct contact. It didn't matter. I had what I needed. Eleanor and I spent the entire weekend poring over the documents, our dining room table now covered in spreadsheets, bank statements, and invoices. She had a background in accounting before becoming a full-time military spouse, and her eyes for numbers were far sharper than mine. "Marcus, look at this," she said on Saturday afternoon, tapping a line item on the 2022 expense report. "Landscaping services, Patriot Pride Lawn Care. They're being paid $12,000 a month." I raised an eyebrow. $12,000? For what? Mowing the quarter-acre of grass at the front entrance and trimming a few bushes? "Exactly," she said, her fingers flying across her calculator. "That's $144,000 a year. That's more than the entire budget for road maintenance and the community pool combined. It's an insane number for the work being done." The name Patriot Pride was insultingly ironic. It was a generic, jingoistic name designed to sound unimpeachable. But I had a feeling it was a hollow front. My next step was a series of database searches. I ran the company name through the state's business registry. Patriot Pride Lawn Care was a registered LLC. The registered agent and sole officer was a man named Frank Miller. A quick social media search confirmed my suspicion. Frank Miller was Karen's brother-in-law. His online profile was a gallery of blurry photos of him on a fishing boat and angry political memes. There was not a single picture of a lawnmower or any landscaping equipment. The company had been formed just 3 months after Karen was elected HOA president. This was no longer just about petty tyranny. This was about corruption. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry bully. She was using her position to enrich her own family at the expense of every single homeowner in Liberty Meadows. The exorbitant fines she levied weren't just for enforcement. They were padding a budget that was being systematically drained into her brother-in-law's pocket. This discovery changed the entire strategic landscape. I now had leverage that went far beyond HOA bylaws and federal flag laws. This was potential criminal fraud. My alliance of aggrieved neighbors was growing. Sarah Jackson had spoken to another military wife who had been fined for a disapproved welcome mat. Mr. Gable had a friend who was cited for having a satellite dish that was allegedly visible from the street, a clear violation of FCC rules protecting homeowner rights. I called a quiet meeting at my house. I invited the Jacksons, Mr. Gable, and 2 other couples who had expressed their frustration. I laid out my findings on the dining room table: the stack of illegal fines, the highlighted copy of the Flag Act, and the damning financial records pointing to Frank Miller's company. I explained the situation calmly, like delivering a mission briefing. Karen's power, I concluded, is built on 2 things: our fear and our isolation. She picks us off one by one, making us believe we are the only ones causing trouble. But looking around this table, we know that's a lie. She is the problem. And her financial dealings, I paused, letting the weight of my next words sink in, have given us a weapon she won't be able to defend against. The mood in the room shifted from fearful resignation to a steely resolve. For the first time, they saw a path to victory. But one of the homeowners, a cautious man named David, raised a valid point. "This is great, Marcus, but it's our word against hers. She controls the board. She'll just deny it and bury us in more fines and legal fees." He was right. I needed an unimpeachable witness, an expert who could validate our claims. I needed a lawyer. That's when Mr. Gable cleared his throat. I might know someone, he said softly. My neighbor, Arthur Henderson. He was a corporate lawyer for 40 years. Retired now. Karen fined him last year for the color of his bird bath. He just paid it to make her go away. But I know it bothered him. He hates bullies. That night I walked over to Arthur Henderson's house. He was a small, neat man with sharp eyes behind thick glasses. I laid out my case, presenting the evidence with the same precision I had with the other neighbors. He listened intently, his fingers steepled, not saying a word until I was finished. He then picked up the invoice from Patriot Pride Lawn Care and stared at it for a long time. Good Lord, he finally whispered, looking up at me. This is embezzlement, plain and simple. She's not just a bully, she's a common thief. He looked at me, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw the kind of strategic alliance that could truly turn the tide. General, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, I believe it's time to come out of retirement. Let's go to war. With Arthur Henderson on board, our small rebellion transformed into a disciplined, legal, and strategic operation. Arthur's mind was a steel trap for legal procedure and corporate governance. While I had the raw intelligence and the command experience, he had the specific knowledge of contract law and civil procedure that would allow us to weaponize Karen's own rulebook against her. Our first joint session was another marathon at my dining room table. Arthur reviewed my dossier with a lawyer's critical eye, nodding in approval at my meticulous documentation. This is excellent, Marcus, he said, tapping the stack of dated photographs and certified mail receipts. Most people get angry and just yell, "You've built a prosecutor's case file." He confirmed my suspicions about the landscaping contract. It was a clear conflict of interest and a breach of her fiduciary duty to the HOA. The fact that she hadn't disclosed her relationship with the vendor was, in itself, grounds for removal. But Arthur advised a strategy of patience. We don't want to just get her removed, he argued. We want to dismantle her entire power structure and make sure this never happens again. A direct accusation of fraud right now would just lead to a messy, he said, she said battle. We need to catch her in an undeniable public trap. Our strategy would be twofold. First, we would continue to gather evidence and expand our coalition. Second, we would use the HOA's own mechanisms to force a public confrontation where we controlled the narrative. Arthur drafted a formal demand for a special meeting of the homeowners, a right granted in the bylaws if a petition was signed by 10% of the residents. Our small group of 5 families was already close to that number. We spent the next week quietly canvassing the neighborhood. It was a delicate process. We didn't lead with accusations of fraud. We started by asking about the flagpole. Have you seen the new flagpole at the general's house? What do you think? The responses were overwhelmingly positive. That was our opening. We would then share the story of Karen's fines and then listen. Inevitably, that would open the floodgates to their own stories of harassment and intimidation. By the end of the week, we had signatures from over 30% of the homeowners. We had more than enough to force the meeting. While this was happening, I began to explore an angle that had been nagging at the back of my mind: the physical proximity of Liberty Meadows to Fort Sheridan. As the former base commander, I was intimately familiar with the legal and territorial agreements between the base and the surrounding civilian communities. Military bases don't just exist in a vacuum. They have buffer zones, noise easements, and utility right-of-ways that extend into the neighboring properties. I drove to the county records office and pulled the original plat maps for the Liberty Meadows development, along with all recorded easements. I spent an entire day cross-referencing these maps with satellite imagery and the HOA's own community layout diagrams. And then I found it. It was a 10-foot wide strip of land running along the entire northern border of the subdivision, the side that abutted the Fort Sheridan perimeter fence. It was a federally owned utility easement granted to the Department of the Army in perpetuity for the maintenance of a critical communications cable. The easement explicitly forbade the construction of any permanent or semi-permanent structures upon it. My eyes went wide. I immediately pulled up the satellite view again and zoomed in on the northern border. Right in the middle of the easement, proudly displayed on the HOA's website as a community enhancement project, was Karen's pet project from the previous year. A fenced-in community garden, complete with raised beds, a tool shed, and a large decorative sign that read, Liberty Meadows Green Thumb Garden. K. Miller, President. She had, in her arrogant ignorance, directed the HOA to build her legacy project directly on United States government property. This was the silver bullet. This was the undeniable, indefensible error that Arthur had been looking for. This wasn't a violation of a mere HOA bylaw. It was a federal trespass. Her other transgressions, the illegal fines, the financial mismanagement, could be argued, denied, or explained away by a clever lawyer. But a physical structure built illegally on a military easement was a matter of property law, surveyors, and federal jurisdiction. It was a ticking time bomb, and I was the only one in the neighborhood who knew it was there. I called Arthur immediately. "I've got it," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's better than the financials. It's the coup de grace." I explained what I had found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he let out a low whistle. "My God, Marcus. She built her garden on an army easement?" "She did," I confirmed. "And I think," I said, allowing a rare note of grim satisfaction into my voice, "that as the former commanding general of the installation that owns that easement, my testimony on the matter might just carry a little bit of weight." The trap was now set. The special meeting was our chosen kill zone. The financial evidence and the pattern of harassment would be the initial volley, designed to soften the target and win the hearts and minds of the other homeowners. The federal easement violation would be the final, decisive strike from which there was no recovery. The formal petition for the special meeting was submitted to the HOA board, legally compelling them to schedule it within 30 days. Karen, of course, chose the very last day allowed by the bylaws, scheduling it for a Wednesday evening in the clubhouse, likely hoping for low attendance. It was a classic bureaucratic maneuver, but one we had anticipated. For the next 4 weeks, our small alliance worked with the quiet efficiency of a special operations team preparing for a mission. We didn't want to just win. We wanted to deliver a victory so decisive that it would permanently alter the political landscape of Liberty Meadows. Arthur Henderson took the lead on preparing the legal framework for our presentation. He drafted motions for a vote of no confidence in Karen as president and another motion to recall the entire board, which had acted as her rubber stamp. He prepared a resolution to immediately void all fines related to the American flag, lawn decorations, children's toys, and other items that fell under the umbrella of Karen's subjective and arbitrary enforcement. Each motion was meticulously researched, citing specific passages from the HOA bylaws and relevant state laws to make them legally airtight. My role was to assemble the presentation of evidence. I converted my dossier into a clear, compelling PowerPoint presentation. It began with a photo of my flagpole and the initial violation notice. It then moved through a timeline of harassment, featuring anonymized but powerful testimonials from the Jacksons, Mr. Gable, and a dozen other families. I included photographs of the violations, the toys, the flowerbed stones, the wrong shade of beige. Each story was a single brushstroke in a larger portrait of systemic abuse. The next section of the presentation was the financial bombshell. I created simple, easy-to-read charts that showed the absurdly inflated payments to Patriot Pride Lawn Care. I included a screenshot of the state business registry showing Frank Miller as the owner and a family photo, scraped from social media, of Karen with her arm around her smiling brother-in-law at a family BBQ. The visual evidence was damning and required no complex explanation. It was pure, unadulterated nepotism and probable fraud. The final part of the presentation was my ace in the hole, the federal easement. I had a slide with the county plat map clearly showing the easement. Next to it, a high-resolution satellite image with the Green Thumb Garden outlined in a bright red, incriminating box. The final slide in that section was a simple text slide: federal trespass on a U.S. Army easement, potential consequences, federal fines, mandated removal at HOA expense, and legal action by the Department of Justice. We decided to hold this final piece of evidence back. I would present the harassment and the financial data first. We would let Karen and her board respond, let them dig their own graves with denials and deflections. Only when she was at her most arrogant and dismissive would I introduce the easement. It was a classic military tactic. Commit your primary forces to fix the enemy in place, then use your reserve to strike the decisive blow at their weakest point. In the days leading up to the meeting, we executed a communications plan. We went door to door, not with petitions this time, but with simple professional flyers announcing the date and time of the special meeting. The flyer didn't make accusations. It simply posed questions. Are you concerned about rising HOA fees? Do you feel the covenant enforcement is fair and equitable? Your voice matters. Be heard. We wanted to maximize attendance to ensure the entire community bore witness. On the day of the meeting, I put on my old uniform. Not my dress blues, but my daily service uniform, the one I had worn at the Pentagon and at Fort Sheridan. It was clean, pressed, and adorned with the ribbons and rank that told the story of my career. It was a calculated decision. It wasn't about intimidation. It was about credibility. When I stood up to speak, I wouldn't just be Marcus Thorne, the new guy with the flagpole. I would be Major General Thorne, a man who had led soldiers in combat and managed multi-billion-dollar budgets. The uniform was a symbol of service, duty, and integrity, everything Karen Miller was not. As Eleanor and I walked toward the clubhouse that evening, the air was thick with tension. We saw Karen by the entrance, greeting her few loyal allies with smug confidence. She saw me, her eyes lingering on the 2 stars on my collar, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than arrogance in her eyes. It might have been uncertainty. It was too late for that. The battle was already joined. The residents were filing in, far more than she had anticipated. The room was going to be packed. The trap was set, the bait was laid, and the target was walking right into the center of it. The clubhouse meeting room was stuffy and overcrowded, buzzing with the nervous energy of a community on the verge of a civil war. At least 70 homeowners had turned out, far more than the usual dozen who attended the regular monthly meetings. They filled every chair and stood 3 deep against the back wall. Karen and her 2 board members, a timid-looking man and a woman with an identical air of sour entitlement, sat at a folding table at the front, looking slightly overwhelmed by the turnout, but still radiating an aura of untouchable authority. Karen, dressed in a garish purple pantsuit, banged a small gavel on the table. "All right, let's get this so-called special meeting started," she announced, her voice dripping with disdain. "As per the petition, the floor is first given to Mr. Thorne. You have 10 minutes." She gestured toward a flimsy lectern, a smug smile playing on her lips. She thought she could control the proceedings, limit my time, and frame this as the petty grievance of one disgruntled resident. She was mistaken. I walked to the front of the room, my uniform feeling less like a costume and more like armor. I placed my laptop on the lectern and connected it to the projector we had insisted on setting up beforehand. I looked out at the faces in the crowd, my allies giving me subtle nods of encouragement, others looking curious, and a few, Karen's cronies, glaring with open hostility. I ignored them all and focused on the undecided majority. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm and measured, carrying easily through the quiet room. "My name is Marcus Thorne. For 35 years, I served in the United States Army, and for the last 5 of those years, I had the privilege of commanding the men and women next door at Fort Sheridan. My wife and I chose to retire here in Liberty Meadows because we wanted to be part of a peaceful, well-managed community." I paused, letting my introduction sink in before I advanced my position. But in the last 2 months, it has become clear that this community is not being managed. It is being ruled. And that is something I can no longer stand by and watch. I clicked to the first slide, a picture of my flagpole, the American flag waving against a clear blue sky. This is what started it all. For displaying this flag, a flag I have served under my entire adult life, I have been fined over $3,000 by our HOA president, Ms. Miller. A murmur went through the crowd. I clicked through the next slides quickly, showing the escalating fines and Karen's handwritten note dismissing federal law. Then I moved to the pattern of abuse. But my story is not unique. I showed a photo of the Jackson's plastic slide. This cost a young military family whose husband is currently deployed $200 in fines for lawn clutter. Sarah Jackson, sitting in the front row, looked down, but her jaw was set. I showed a photo of Mr. Gable's flower bed. This beautiful memorial to a man's late wife cost him $150 because it was half an inch too high. Mr. Gable stared straight ahead, his quiet dignity more powerful than any angry outburst. For the next 5 minutes, I presented a relentless, fact-based assault on Karen's reign, showing photo after photo of petty violations and the exorbitant fines attached. The murmuring in the room grew louder, changing from curiosity to anger. I could see Karen shifting in her seat, her smug expression melting into a tight, defensive scowl. She tried to interrupt. "This is out of order. This is just a list of people who don't want to follow the rules." The crowd shouted her down. "Let him speak!" Someone yelled from the back. I held up a hand for quiet. "Ms. Miller is right about one thing," I said, turning to face her. "This is about rules. It's about her rule that HOA covenants are more important than the freedom to display the American Flag Act. It's about her rule that a child's toy is a violation. And it's about her rule that she can spend our money any way she sees fit." That was my transition. I clicked to the next slide. The header read, "Where does your money go?" A pie chart showed over 60% of the community's maintenance budget going to a single vendor, Patriot Pride Lawn Care. The next slide showed the company's registration with Frank Miller's name prominent. The final slide in the sequence was the photo of a beaming Karen with her arm around Frank. A collective gasp went through the room. This was no longer about taste or interpretation. This was about money. Their money. Ms. Miller has been paying her brother-in-law's company, a company with no other known clients, over $140,000 a year of our money for minimal work. This isn't just a conflict of interest. It is a betrayal of our trust and a potential felony. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions at the board. Karen was banging her gavel, her face purple with rage. "Lies! These are all lies! My brother-in-law does excellent work. This is a personal attack." Arthur Henderson, calm and composed, stepped forward. "I believe now is the time to introduce a motion," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I move for a vote of no confidence in Karen Miller as president of this HOA." Hands shot up all over the room. The trap had been sprung. Karen was surrounded, her credibility shattered, her corruption laid bare for the entire community to see. But I wasn't finished. I still had my reserve force, my final decisive weapon, and I was waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it. The chaos in the room was a storm of righteous indignation. Homeowners who had been silent for years, nursing private grievances, now felt empowered to speak. They shouted questions about their own fines, about the lack of transparency, about the state of the pool that never seemed to get repaired despite the massive landscaping budget. Karen, cornered and exposed, abandoned all pretense of presidential decorum. She was screaming, her voice cracking with fury, pointing her finger at me. "This is a conspiracy. He's a troublemaker, a military bully trying to take over our neighborhood. He can't stand a strong woman in charge." Her two board members sat in stunned silence, their faces pale, offering her no support. They were like junior officers watching their commander have a complete breakdown on the battlefield, unsure of what to do. Arthur let the chaos swell for a moment before holding up his hands for quiet. "We have a motion on the floor," he said calmly. "A vote of no confidence. All in favor?" A forest of hands went up, a near unanimous wave of dissent. "All opposed." Only Karen's two board members and a handful of her known cronies raised their hands. "The motion carries," Arthur declared with finality. "Karen Miller is removed as president, effective immediately." A cheer went through the room, but Karen wasn't finished. She slammed her hands on the table. "You can't do this. This is an illegal meeting. I am still the president. Our lawyer will tear this apart. You have no authority." It was the exact opening I had been waiting for. This was the moment of maximum arrogance, her final desperate grasp for a power she no longer possessed. I walked back to the lectern and clicked the remote for my presentation. A new image appeared on the screen, silencing the room once more. It was the county plat map, with the 10-foot wide federal easement highlighted in bright red along the northern edge of the property. "Ms. Miller is talking about authority," I said, my voice dropping to a serious, commanding tone. "So let's talk about authority. Let's talk about federal authority." I clicked to the next slide, the satellite image showing her green thumb garden, sitting squarely inside the red box of the easement. Last year, under Miss Miller's direction, this HOA spent $8,000 of our money to build a community garden. A lovely idea in principle. Unfortunately, she built it on property that does not belong to us. I let that statement hang in the air. You could see the confusion on people's faces as they processed the information. That red box, I explained, gesturing to the screen, is a federally protected utility easement owned by the Department of the Army for the maintenance of a secure communications line running to Fort Sheridan. No permanent structures are permitted on that land. Not a fence, not a shed, not even a raised garden bed. I turned my gaze directly to Karen, whose face had gone from purple with rage to a ghastly bloodless white. She was finally starting to understand the magnitude of her blunder. This is no longer an HOA matter, I continued, addressing the entire room. This is a federal matter. This is trespassing on government property. As the former commanding general of Fort Sheridan, I can tell you exactly what happens next. The base commander will be notified. Federal surveyors will be dispatched. A formal order will be issued to the Liberty Meadows HOA to remove all infringing structures at our own expense. If we fail to comply, the Army Corps of Engineers will come in, demolish the garden, and send our HOA the bill, which will be far more than the $8,000 it cost to build. There will also be significant federal fines. The room was utterly silent. The gravity of the situation was sinking in. They weren't just facing the consequences of a corrupt president. They were facing the legal and financial might of the United States government. So when you talk about authority, Ms. Miller, I said, my voice like ice, you should know that your authority ends where federal property begins. You have, through your incompetence and arrogance, exposed every single homeowner in this room to massive financial and legal liability. I let the weight of that truth settle over them. Karen stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. She had no defense. There was no bylaw to hide behind, no way to spin this as a personal attack. It was a map. It was a fact. It was an unmitigated disaster of her own making. Arthur Henderson stepped forward once more. I would like to introduce a second motion, he said into the stunned silence. I move to recall the entire current board of directors and to elect an interim board to manage this crisis and schedule new elections. It was over. Karen's reign had not just ended. It had been annihilated. The final crushing blow had been delivered, and the battlefield was quiet. All that was left was to survey the damage and begin the long process of rebuilding. The vote to recall the entire board was a mere formality. It passed with no opposition except from the two board members themselves, who seemed to shrink in their chairs under the collective glare of the community. In the span of 30 minutes, Karen Miller's entire power structure had been utterly dismantled. She didn't say another word. She simply gathered her useless gavel and clipboard and, without making eye contact with anyone, shuffled out of the clubhouse, a politically vanquished figure. The homeowners, dazed but resolute, immediately nominated and elected an interim board. Arthur Henderson was unanimously voted as the interim president, with Sarah Jackson and a level-headed accountant named Ben Carter elected to serve alongside him. Their first official act was to pass the resolution Arthur had prepared, immediately voiding all of Karen's punitive fines related to flags, toys, and aesthetic violations. A wave of relief washed over the room. It was as if a great oppressive weight had been lifted from the community's shoulders. The second act of the interim board was to formally address the crisis I had revealed. Arthur, now speaking with the full authority of his new position, addressed me directly. General Thorne, he said, his tone formal but his eyes showing a deep gratitude, the board would like to thank you for bringing this grave matter to our attention. We would be honored if you would act as the community's official liaison to the command at Fort Sheridan to resolve this easement issue. I accepted, of course. The next morning, I made a phone call to the new commanding general of Fort Sheridan, a bright young brigadier I had mentored years ago. I explained the situation, and to his credit, he was understanding. He agreed to work with the new HOA board on a timeline for the garden's removal, holding off on any fines as long as the community showed good faith in rectifying the problem. The threat of a massive financial penalty was neutralized by diplomacy and mutual respect, concepts that had been entirely foreign to Karen. The following Saturday, something remarkable happened. Dozens of residents armed with shovels, wheelbarrows, and power tools gathered at the illegal community garden. Led by the new interim board, we spent the entire day dismantling Karen's folly. We took down the fence, disassembled the raised beds, and carefully relocated the plants to a new, legally sited patch of common ground near the clubhouse. It wasn't a chore, it was a celebration. People were laughing, sharing water and stories of their old encounters with Karen. It was the most united I had seen the community since I'd moved in. As we worked, Mr. Gable came over to me, his hands dirty with soil. "You know," he said, gesturing with his trowel, "I never thought I'd see a day like this. I was ready to just dig up my wife's stones and let her win." I clapped him on the shoulder. "Bullies only win, Mr. Gable, when good people decide not to fight back." The investigation into Karen's financial dealings was swift. The new board hired a forensic accountant who quickly uncovered undeniable evidence of embezzlement and fraud. The case was turned over to the local district attorney. Karen Miller, who had lorded her power over so many, was now facing criminal charges. Her brother-in-law's Patriot Pride lawn care contract was terminated, and a legitimate local company was hired for half the price, immediately freeing up tens of thousands of dollars in the HOA budget. The healing of Liberty Meadows had begun. The climate of fear was replaced by one of cooperation. The new board established transparent rules and a fair, impartial process for handling disputes. They held open meetings where residents' concerns were actually heard. The community wasn't perfect, but it was finally a democracy, not a dictatorship. A few weeks later, we held a neighborhood-wide barbecue on the main common green. It was the new board's idea, a way to celebrate our reclaimed community. As the sun began to set, I stood on my front porch with Eleanor, looking out at the families grilling, kids playing, and neighbors talking as friends. My flagpole stood tall, the flag illuminated by its dedicated light, no longer a symbol of defiance, but a quiet testament to a battle won. Eleanor squeezed my hand. "It's a good place to be retired, General," she said softly. I nodded, a feeling of deep satisfaction settling over me. "It is now, El. It is now." The war was over. Peace had been restored, not by force of arms, but by the force of truth, strategy, and the simple, unshakable courage of a community that decided it had had enough. And the flag flew on, a beacon of the very liberty we had fought so hard in our own small way to secure. The aftermath of Karen's downfall settled into a new, more hopeful routine for Liberty Meadows. The interim board, under Arthur Henderson's steady leadership, proved to be as effective in governance as they had been in revolution. Their first 90 days were a whirlwind of reform. They rewrote the most ambiguous and punitive sections of the covenants, establishing clear, objective standards for property maintenance that eliminated the potential for subjective abuse. Fines were now a last resort, preceded by friendly reminders in a formal, transparent appeals process. The community newsletter, once a platform for Karen's self-aggrandizing announcements, became a genuine source of information, featuring meeting minutes, budget transparency reports, and profiles on new families moving into the neighborhood. The change was palpable. The oppressive atmosphere of surveillance was gone. Kids' toys reappeared on lawns in the afternoons. People put up holiday decorations without fear of getting a violation notice for using the wrong color of lights. The sense of community, which had been withered by years of petty tyranny, began to blossom again. My role as liaison with Fort Sheridan concluded amicably. The base command was satisfied with the swift removal of the garden from the easement, and the relationship between the military and the civilian community was stronger than ever. In fact, the new HOA board and the base's morale, welfare, and recreation office began co-hosting community events, like a 4th of July fireworks display and a joint 5K charity run, further bridging the gap that Karen's anti-military rhetoric had tried to widen. As for Karen, her fall from grace was total and public. The local news, which we had initially invited to the special meeting, followed the story of her indictment for embezzlement. Her trial was a short, pathetic affair. The evidence compiled by the forensic accountant was overwhelming. The paper trail of inflated invoices, bank transfers to her brother-in-law, and the lack of any credible accounting for the funds was undeniable. She was found guilty of felony fraud and sentenced to 18 months in state prison in order to pay full restitution to the Liberty Meadows HOA. Her house went up for sale shortly after her conviction. The for sale sign on the lawn, a final quiet monument to her failed reign. The day she was sentenced, I felt not a sense of vengeful glee, but a sober satisfaction. Justice had been served. A system that allowed for abuse had been corrected, and the person who exploited it had been held accountable. It was the same sense of order restored that I'd felt after a successful military operation. The mission was complete. One afternoon, a few months later, Sarah Jackson stopped by. Her husband, the major, had just returned from his deployment. They were having a small welcome home party and wanted Eleanor and me to come. "I just wanted to thank you again, General," she said, standing on my porch. "Before you stood up, I was honestly thinking of asking for a transfer. I didn't want to raise my son in a place that felt so hostile. You didn't just save us from a few fines, you made this feel like a home." Her words meant more to me than any medal. The true victory wasn't in defeating Karen. It was in creating the conditions for a young family to feel safe and welcome. It was in Mr. Gable tending his roses without fear. It was in the sound of children's laughter carrying across the lawns on a summer evening. My life settled into the peaceful rhythm I had originally sought. My mornings were spent on long walks, my afternoons reading on the porch, and my evenings with Eleanor. But the fight had changed me. It had reminded me that leadership isn't always about commanding armies on foreign soil. Sometimes it's about standing up for your neighbors. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in stuffy clubhouse meeting rooms, with bylaws and spreadsheets as your weapons. It taught me that tyranny can take root anywhere, even in a manicured suburban paradise, if good people remain silent. And it reaffirmed my belief that a well-organized, determined group of citizens, armed with the truth, is a force more powerful than any tin pot dictator. My flagpole stands as a landmark in the neighborhood now. People sometimes point it out to visitors, not just as the General's house, but as the place where the Liberty Meadows Revolution began. The flag that flies there, the same one that saw conflict and hardship overseas, now represents a different kind of victory. It's a symbol of a community's resilience, a reminder that the principles of freedom and justice are not just abstract ideals to be defended in faraway lands, but precious rights to be actively protected right here at home.